All right. Yeah. So thank you all for being here, giving the time to us today to kind of present. Amy and I are Pathmaker Law, and today we're going to talk about different regulatory pathways that you should be considering in bringing your medical device to market in the U.S. This presentation is intended for healthcare startups, and some of the details are kind of focused on software medical device companies. We see a lot of action in the software as a medical device space, and we kind of try to tailor the information to that audience in particular. But if you have any other questions, in general, we're happy to take those questions live, or if you have questions after the presentation, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to get you that information to the best of our abilities as well. So we'll start with introductions. Amy, do you want me to? I can introduce. So I'll start with Amy. Amy is the founder of Pathmaker Law. She's 33 years as a regulatory affairs professional and healthcare attorney. She started her career at 3M, spent 16 years in the regulatory affairs group. She focused on medical devices and pharmaceuticals. And then she has 14 years as well as an attorney with deep experience in FDA meetings and regulatory submissions for devices across the regulatory spectrum, from software and medical devices. We're discussing Class 2 devices and PMA, or Class 3 devices. She has, and as well as founding and operating the firm and counseling clients, she's also a professor, and she spent 9 years as faculty at St. Cloud State in their regulatory affairs master's program. I am Theodore Thompson. I too am an attorney at Pathmaker Law. Altogether, I have 14 years as a regulatory affairs professional and healthcare attorney. I got my career started at Medtronic. You may know Medtronic as the world's largest medical device company. I started by supporting both pre-market and post-market medical device submissions. So I was helping keep their products on the market after they had received clearance, and then also would help get new products reviewed with the FDA. While I was at Medtronic, I supported not only physical medical devices, but also combination products, so devices that incorporated some pharmaceutical component in them as well. After Medtronic, I transitioned to practice as a private attorney at a boutique FDA law firm, and I've spent the last 4 years working with companies, large and small, counseling them on FDA regulatory questions they have, helping them craft and execute regulatory pathways, deal with interactions with the FDA, and just generally helping companies large and small in this area. So we're happy to help you with whatever question you may have as well. Oh, I should also say that we've helped clients both inside and outside the USA. So our audience is not specifically just to companies that are located in the USA, but we also have international clients that we help bring their products to market in the USA. So let's start with the agenda and sort of lay the groundwork. So these are the topics that we plan to cover today in our speech. And it helps to kind of, for you to generate some ideas and think about your understanding in this space. So some of the questions you might want to ask yourself, if you understand the difference between a general wellness product and a medical device. This is one of the topics that we'll kind of talk about and talk to, but it's worth considering if your device falls into one of these categories and what that means in bringing your product to market. It's also helpful to kind of consider if you understand the concepts of design controls. That's another topic that we will touch on. But we're happy to address questions if you have any in that area as well. Are you familiar with determining the device classification and then what that means for the regulatory pathway for your product? Do you know how to figure out the testing and documentation needed for a pre-market regulatory submission, what that may look like in practice, or where to find out what sorts of standards and testing is expected by the FDA in your submission? Do you know what user fees apply to your application, your submission type, and know whether you qualify as a small business and what that may mean for the user fees, whether you could get a reduced user fee and how you could save money in handling or in dealing with the FDA by falling under that category. Another important consideration, and one of the topics we'll cover, is how to choose a predicate device, some general considerations and strategies. Are you familiar with choosing a predicate device for a product that is classified as Class 2 and will go through the 510(k) regulatory pathway? And then finally, another area we'll cover are pre-sub or Q-sub meetings with the FDA. Are you familiar with the sorts of topics that you may want to address in a Q-sub meeting, or may want to not address, may want to stay away from? That's one area that we'll cover as well. We'll start by taking a high-level view at the intended use. A medical device or product's intended use is really key in determining its regulatory classification. The intended use of a product, the intended use, is, just generally speaking, what the device manufacturer's objective intent for the product, what it is supposed to do, and the intended patient population that it is focused on. You may be familiar with the intended use as it applies to medical devices. The intended use describes it in a very general way. And then there's also something called the indication for use. The indication for use describes that device in a more specific manner. One of the considerations is that the intended use helps determine, or is a major factor used in determining whether your product is a medical device. So the definition of a medical device, they're products that are intended to treat, cure, prevent, mitigate, or diagnose diseases, or intended to affect the structure or any function of the human body. And if your product is intended to do any of those things, then it may be regulated as a medical device. Factors to consider in determining the intended use include those things which you put on the product labeling. So any labeling claims that you may make, any advertising or promotional material, oral statements or written statements that your sales personnel may make, or any implied or expressed claims. So things that you are saying about your medical device, as well as some things that you may be hinting at, can help inform the intended use for that medical device. Do you have anything you'd like to add or contribute on that, Amy? Or
Sure. I'll give a quick example. Think of something like a scarf. Okay, so a scarf could be part of my outfit for the day, but if for some reason I say that this particular piece of fabric could be used as a bandage or a tourniquet or some other kind of medical function, it would actually turn my scarf into a medical device just because I attach those words to it. So it's very important in how an item is presented.
Yeah, excellent point. Your statement of intended use could make an everyday product into a medical device if you are promoting it for that purpose. So your product is a medical device. It may be a medical device based on how you're promoting it and what the intended use is. Well, what does that mean in terms of the regulatory pathway? Well, the FDA regulates medical devices based on the risks they pose to patients and to some extent to users of those medical devices. So it breaks medical devices out into three classes. Class 1 is the lowest risk. Class 2 is intermediate risk, and Class 3 would be the highest risk medical device. Class 3 devices are typically life-supporting and life-sustaining medical devices. So if your device fails, or if the device were to fail, and it puts the patient's life at risk, then it's a good chance that you'd fall into the Class 3 device. Class 2 device is, like I said, the intermediate risk, or newer products which aren't high risk may also fall into the Class 2 or intermediate risk. And then the lowest risk Class 1 devices are generally those that, they're used across the medical field, but but they aren't very invasive in their use. Think of like a tongue depressor is a good example of a class 1 medical device, or to Amy's point as well, a tourniquet, something that has a medical use but isn't a high risk, would be a class 1 low risk device. These different regulatory categories come with different expectations from the FDA. So as is also written in the definition here, class 1 lowest risk includes general controls or expectations of general controls for those medical devices. General controls include such things as some design controls, some complaint handling that you must keep track of and perhaps submit to the FDA, as well as facility registration and listing for the FDA.
And I could also add in compliant labels
Mhm.
and making sure that your product is not adulterated or misbranded.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Yeah, make sure the product is clean and sterile if you're giving it, putting it on the market, and that you're marketing it properly to make sure it's not misbranded. That falls under general controls as well. And then for the class 2, the intermediate risk, the general controls we just described apply to those classes of devices or that class of device, as well as some special controls, what are referred to as special controls. As indicated in their name, special controls may be specific to that device. The FDA breaks down into very specific categories and regulations, different types of medical devices, and it will explain in those specific regulations what special controls apply to that device. And examples of the special controls include sorts of tests that the FDA expects the manufacturer or the person submitting the application to the FDA to submit along with that product. These are tests that you use to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the device, certain standards that you are testing to that the FDA expects you to apply to that product as well.
I could throw out some examples of special controls.
Sure.
Let's say you have a device that has some sort of user interface. Maybe it's a touch screen, or maybe you're using a tablet or a phone to control your device or get information from your device. Often, these types of devices need some sort of human factors or usability test to show that people can actually use it correctly and they might understand symbols. They're able to see colors correctly on the screen and things like that.
Yeah, excellent example. In the class 2 regulation as well, in the class 2 category medical devices, these types of devices are often 510K regulatory pathway devices. And with the 510K, you are demonstrating what's known as substantial equivalence to a predicate device. What that means, we'll explain a little bit as we continue on with the presentation, but what you're doing is trying to find a device which is similar, which is legally marketed, and then you demonstrate that your device is substantially similar and represents the same sorts of risk profile that that device represents, and that you're intending the use in the same way, and you're focusing on the same patient population, same or similar patient population with your device. It's unlike a lot of other regulatory regimes around the world in that you're comparing it to a product that's on the market and trying to say we're safe and effective as this device, so we should be on the market too. Another class or another regulatory pathway for class 2 devices may also be a de novo regulatory pathway where your product doesn't fall into a previously submitted or cleared device type. It represents an intermediate risk. You don't have a predicate to compare it to, but because it is an intermediate risk, the device may be considered on its merits for the class 2 intermediate risk classification. There's additional testing which goes along with the de novo product. It's not necessarily as easy a pathway. I use that quote unquote easy a pathway as the 510K, because there's usually heightened clinical data that goes along with the de novo submission. But the advantage, of course, is that it's not as high a regulatory burden as a PMA type device, class 3 medical device that is represented here on the slide as well. So the class 3 general controls and pre-market approval devices that fall into that category, those require substantial amounts of clinical data to receive approval by the FDA. And those are generally, like I mentioned at the outset, life-supporting and life-sustaining devices. So what tools may be at your disposal in classifying a medical device? Well, one excellent tool is the FDA classification database. How do you use this? Well, one way you use it is by starting with a Google search for your device. You may want to find a similar device that's on the market that has some features that you can identify as similar to your device. Take that device name, you can put it into this FDA classification database, which you can also find using a Google search. Hit the search button, and up will come a bunch of information that helps describe and classify that device. It'll show you the FDA regulatory classification for it, the product code, as well as the route to market that the applicant went through for that specific product. With that information, I mean, there's more digging that you have to do to kind of understand how that might apply to your device, but it's a wealth of information, a great place to start in determining what may apply to your device as well. Do you have anything that you would like to add in terms of the FDA database, Amy? Or
I just want to, emphasize that there are thousands of different FDA classifications. So it's very important not just to think that you're just looking for class 1, class 2, or class 3. You really have to use this database to figure out which specific classification paragraph applies to your product, because this is the basis for telling you what you need to do to comply with the regulations.
Yeah, excellent point. So on the previous slide, we talked about just those broad categories, but knowing which broad category your device fits into is not sufficient. Exactly. To Amy's point, to what she was saying, there are very specific regulations that may apply to your device, and finding those regulations helps you understand very specifically what sort of regulatory pathway you may be looking at. So as we mentioned, there's a lot of activity right now in software as a medical device, and there's certain things that come along with having a software medical device product. Not only do you have to consider what category medical device it is and the specific regulation, but from a high level, it's helpful for you to understand whether your software meets the definition of a medical device or whether it is not a medical device. If it is not a medical device, then your route to path or your pathway to market is a lot clearer and a lot less expensive than if you have to go through an FDA submission. Another possibility is that your software as a medical device meets the definition of a medical device, but is under FDA enforcement discretion. This means that they're kind of taking a hands-off approach to the regulatory requirements for that specific product. We'll talk a bit more about enforcement discretion in the next slide, but that's one possibility.
And I can give an example of a device that could be under the definition of a medical device, but not regulated, actually under enforcement discretion. And that could be something as simple as a little software app that tracks your sleep. This software app is not diagnosing a sleep disorder in any way, but is telling you how many hours were you actually asleep? How many times was your sleep disrupted over those 8 hours? Things like that.
Excellent. And then another category, another classification, or classification might be the wrong choice of words in this, but another way your device may be regulated by the FDA is if it meets the definition of a medical device and is under FDA enforcement. So if a enforcement discretion does not apply to it and it meets the definition of a medical device, then in that likelihood, you're talking about determining which regulatory pathway you need to go through to get the product on the market. So taking Amy's excellent example of a product that is under FDA enforcement discretion, what does that mean in terms of the regulatory requirements? What is the FDA offering, or what is it's applying its discretion to? Well, it's saying that this is a medical device, but we're going to take a lighter approach towards regulating it, and some of the FDA's more stringent requirements don't apply. some of the areas where the FDA, if the product is under FDA enforcement discretion, some of the things that the FDA say did not apply to that product include the medical device reporting and complaint handling requirements. There may be fewer requirements for reporting removals and corrections of those products. There might be fewer requirements in the quality system regulations, which we'll also speak to what that means in practice. And of course, you may not have to submit a 510K or pre-market notification or a PMA, pre-market approval for that product if it's under enforcement discretion. You also may be exempt from establishment registration and device listing requirements, as well as some labeling requirements. So this slide includes some of the exceptions that the FDA may make for products that are under an enforcement discretion for the FDA. You find out whether your product is under enforcement discretion by reading FDA guidance. So the FDA will publish in guidance documents what products fall under its enforcement discretion currently, and then what that enforcement discretion includes from the FDA's perspective for that product. Next, we'll transition to design controls and talk about how that applies to medical devices, as well as software products, software that are classified and regulated as medical devices. So from a high level, design controls are described in the FDA regulations. They are a set of regulations that are intended to ensure that medical devices are designed to meet specific user needs, intended uses, and specific requirements. They require manufacturers to establish and maintain procedures to control the design of their device in order to ensure that these requirements are met. They also require manufacturers to maintain records to show that their device design translates into manufacturing. So as you design the product, it's important that you record those different inputs that go into designing it. And then it's also important that those inputs translate into manufacturing and that all of those steps are recorded along the way. Amy, do you have any other things you'd like to add in terms of design controls? Or
I just want to say that design controls are essential to follow because they actually create the information that define your device and support your device's performance or your safety, efficacy, substantial equivalence. And a lot of this information that is created through the design control process is often used in a 510K, a de novo, or a PMA.
Yeah, excellent. So this forms the bulk of the submission that you send to the FDA. Correct. Yeah, other considerations that we kind of included would be changes to the design, how that's recorded. That falls under the heading of design controls and those different files that you need to keep to show that you've gone through the different steps, the required steps in assessing how those changes may impact the safety and efficacy of that product. That applies both before you submit to the FDA and after, so all of those different steps can be traced. It applies most often after the FDA submission, but if you do change the design at all during the submission process, then it has to be recorded as well, so that there is, that there's a record of it to support the safety and efficacy of the device that you're putting on the market. So a type of product that the FDA has really called out as under FDA enforcement discretion are those types of products that promote a healthy lifestyle. We bring this up here because there's a lot of products that might fall into this category, and it's really important consideration for developers of these types of products from the outset to determine if their product is a lifestyle product, is promoting a healthy lifestyle, then it may be outside of the FDA's regulation, as part of its enforcement discretion for this class of products. So if your product is intended to maintain or encourage a healthy lifestyle and is unrelated to the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treatment of a disease condition, then it may be a general wellness device. The next slide goes into it in a bit more detail, but these types of devices are aimed at encouraging or maintaining a healthy lifestyle. They don't state that they cure a specific disease so much as they may help individuals maintain a healthy lifestyle in dealing with a disease. To Amy's point about a sleep tracker, another example could be a type of product that you can use to track your diet to help maintain a healthy weight. That falls under the heading of a healthy lifestyle. It's not treating or preventing a specific condition so much as it's just helping you be a healthy individual. Do you have any other examples or anything else you'd like to offer on this slide?
There are just so many different products out there that are for exercising, weight loss, and just about all of those are pretty much in that general wellness category, unless they're specifically being put out there for treating diabetes or something that's a little bit more serious.
Yeah, that's an excellent point too. It made me think if you determine that your product is classified in this area, if it falls under the general wellness product, you want to make sure that you're continuing to promote it as such. You don't want to start, saying that your device can prevent diabetes, because then you're getting into the prevention mitigation of a disease. And that promotion is off-label promotion, and you're changing the intended use, to kind of go back to what we were saying as well initially. The intended use statement can be determined based on how you're advertising or promoting it. Now you're taking a product which is not a medical device and promoting it as a medical device. Well, the FDA doesn't like that, and they're likely to put pressure on you to take that product off the market and prevent its entry into the US if you're selling it from outside the US. So if you have a general wellness device, you have to stay in that lane and make sure you're not expanding the scope or application of that medical device to specific to any disease state.
Excuse me, Theo, thank you. I have a question about that.
Sure.
So you say the FDA doesn't like it, and I'm thinking of so many ads that we receive, saying that doctors, they think it's the best, I don't know, toothpaste, or there are so many things. When you say FDA doesn't like it, do you mean that they have a power to, for example, push you to take out, or it's only recommendations?
They do have the power to start a recall and pull that product from the market if they so choose.
Okay.
They generally start by reaching out to the manufacturer and saying you should do this, or more accurately, do this or else. And the manufacturer is the one that takes it off the market. But if they reach out to the manufacturer telling them stop promoting your product in this way, make sure that your promotion is in line with the FDA's regulations. You're selling a product that is adulterated, misbranded, and stop, and they continue that, then yes, the FDA will take it a step further and essentially take it to court and start removing that product from market.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Another type of software that may apply to your product, another product that is worth understanding, is a type of device that includes a lot of software functions but is not classified as a medical device, and this comes by action of statute. So this is an important area of software or healthcare software that the FDA has decided it's going to allow to develop but not regulate as medical devices for such, and that is medical device data systems. So if your software is intended to transfer or store, convert formats, or display clinical test data and results, then it may not fall under the classification of a medical device and may not have to go through the FDA's regulatory pathway to be offered on market. However, if that medical device data system starts interpreting or analyzing any of the data that it is holding, then it's going into the area of diagnosing potentially or offering a prognosis of the information, and it starts falling under the description of a medical device product and would have to go through the FDA regulatory pathway to be properly marketed.
Do you want me to throw out a quick example?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So let's say there's a device that automatically takes a patient's blood pressure. And they take that information and they put it into the electronic health record. So the device that actually takes the blood pressure, that's a medical device. The software that transfers that information from that device and puts it into an electronic health record, that is not a device because it's just transferring information. And maybe that software stores it. So, and then there might be another device on the other end that actually takes that and analyzes it and says, look, this patient has consistently had high blood pressure readings for the last 3 times that they've been checked. Now I need to alert the physician and have them look at this patient more closely. So keep in mind all these different steps that might be in a process of taking that information and which parts of it are devices and which are not.
That's a very good point, Amy, because we have a product called Life Lens here at 360 Social Impact Studios. We co-founded it with a team of students and innovators that we have, and recently got acquired. It's a wearable AI-powered device for nurses to do transcription and interact with the EMR in hands-free. And so we have the device, we have a provisional patent on the process, the method of how we take that data, input it into the EMR, and then the process of storing that data while it processes it, the language, and then inputs, the other kind of summarizes and keep the other areas of the form. So we've had to navigate this acutely as we've tried to figure out also how to stay away from being classified as as a certain thing. I don't know if you're getting into 501k exemptions, but or 510k exemptions, but those are things that a number of our teams also look to as trying to reduce that classification, I think.
Right, right. And so there are a lot of considerations here, and a lot of companies do work with us to help them figure out how do they avoid being regulated as a medical device.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can create a justification for why it's not a medical device under the statutes and execute based on that determination, then your path to market might be a lot cleaner, a lot smoother than if you are classified as a medical device.
How often do you see companies going from, maybe originally thinking that they're going to be classified class 2, class 3 medical device, but then thinking, well, after evaluating it, actually the 510k is probably the path of least resistance if it's possible.
Yeah. So it's a very, very typical question that a lot of companies have. And a lot of companies want to know, is this regulated as a device? Is it not? What can we do to down classify or actually put our device into a non-regulated situation, such as under enforcement discretion or have it 510k exempt? Some companies are left with, these are your options. And if you really want a certain claim or a certain intended use, sometimes it's hard to avoid that medical device definition.
Like the Apple Watch, where they put on where for the last 16 months, they haven't been able to market themselves as a blood pressure monitor, but now they're back able to advertise that feature.
Right. And they may have had to file a de novo. I know that Apple has filed a couple de novos for some of their features that are really healthcare apps that are medical devices that are on their watch. I've worked with other devices that were wearables that did some analysis, provided therapy. It's a very common type of invention these days to have some sort of wearable device.
Yeah, and I think one of our founders is on the call today. Cloud, the founder of OM3 Gym and Cosfinity, she has a wearable and it's a therapeutic, it's like physical therapy device, but it collects data, and it's certainly, I think, some of the questions that we're going to have to address with her in getting the device on the market is how to up or down classify it depending on how we want to position that. So
Okay.
thank you. That was good.
Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah, happy to take questions. This is great. Okay, so next slide. Amy, I think this is where we plan
Okay.
to, transition.
So here's another tool that is very useful. So this pre-market notification is essentially a 510(k) database, allows anyone to go in online and, using the various fields here, search for potential predicate devices. So let's say you've already figured out what the device intended use is, what the functionality is, and you've decided it is a medical device. Perhaps you've classified it and found out that your particular device is not 510(k) exempt, and it does require 510(k). So then one of the first steps in preparing a 510(k) for FDA review is to choose a predicate device. And very often you will be looking at other similar devices that are on the market that may have already been cleared by using this particular database. So you may not see the entire 510(k). There are just a few 510(k)s where the entire 510(k) is available, but this gives you the 510(k) summary for many, many devices. And you can see things like intended use, device description. You can see a comparison table of how they compared their device to their predicate. You can look at various things like which standards for testing did they apply to support their clearance. So this is a very useful tool.
Yeah.
Right.
And this one is specific to, this database is specific to 510(k) products. The previous database that we mentioned was more of a general medical device database.
Right. And keep in mind, there are also databases for de novos, pre-market approval. There are a whole variety of different tools that are available online from the FDA to help figure out your own strategy.
And Amy, can you tell us what a de novo is? I feel like there's
Sure.
a lot of jargon sometimes, and this is a highly, I'm sure
Okay.
there's so many, so that would be
Sure. So Theo, let's go on to the next slide, because I think we have
Absolutely. I think it does mention.
slides coming up quickly that get into a little bit of, and here it is. Okay, so let's say you have a medical device that does need to have some sort of pre-market review by FDA. And so you want to legally get on the market in the US. So the regulatory path is determined by the classification. A PMA, pre-market approval, is for class 3 devices. It is a big, expensive investment to create a PMA device. Often has lots of clinical trial work supporting it, but we're talking about PMAs for things like important cardiac implants and things like that. Okay, 510(k)s are by far the most common way that devices get to market in the US. There are like 3,000 510(k)s filed with FDA every year. So it's primarily for well understood classified class 2 devices. They're just a myriad of different devices that fit into class 2. So most class 1 devices do not have to go through any sort of PMA or 510(k) pre-market review. However, there are just a couple. And I'll give you one example, and that's examination gloves. They're class 1, but examination gloves have gotten to be very important in protecting people from handling opioids or handling body fluids that may have pathogens in them, that sort of things. So that's a type of device that has become more high risk and more important over the years, and so it needs a 510(k). So a de novo is for a device that is low to moderate risk, but it does not have a classification or a predicate. I'll give you an example of a de novo submission that I did a few years ago, and that was for a wearable from a company called Nightwear. So what the Apple Watch did is it took the patient's or the person's information on their body movement and their heart rate overnight while they're sleeping, and it set a baseline for what's normal and what is not. And so this watch would monitor this information overnight while the person's sleeping. And if they saw this increase in heart rate and body movement that was not typical, they said, aha, I believe that this person is having a nightmare, and would actually jiggle the person's wrist and bump them out of a sleep state. So that was a very novel device to have a therapeutic, a wearable that would help people with nightmares. That went de novo. And like I said, there were different things that Apple has done recently as well, that their apps also went through the de novo process. So keep in mind, there's a huge difference in what we have for time and money investments in these various pathways. So sometimes a company will say, you know what, we're going to drop a certain claim, or we're not going to pursue a certain functionality because that would bump us up into a class 2 or class 3, and we really just want to stay class 1. So you can do different strategies in your design and figure out where you want to be and how much you want to invest in time and money. Okay. A little bit about a 510K. It's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. You always have this predicate device that is something that has already been cleared by FDA, and substantially equivalence is the key. So you don't say, my device is safe and effective, FDA. You say, my device is substantially equivalent to another device. And there's an assumption in this comparison that there's safety and efficacy because you're very similar to another device that FDA has already cleared. So there's two big things that go into substantial equivalence, and that is looking for the same intended use and looking for the same technological characteristics. The technological characteristics can be different. For example, you might have a different type of energy or a different type of mode, a different type of patient population, something's different, hence the comparison apples to oranges. But you convince the FDA that these differences do not create different questions of safety or efficacy.
Mhm.
So 510K is very common. We do a lot of 510K work.
Mhm.
So I think that's a little bit of an introduction.
Yeah.
Okay, so there it is. The same intended use, same technological characteristics, or you have different technological characteristics, but you're as safe and effective as the predicate device. Okay. So keep in mind that these submissions are supported by data, non-clinical performance data. So here are some examples. I brought up before, you might have human factors and usability required for a wearable. Can the person function the watch and the phone or the computer and make this work? There might be, if you have a software device, you might have to look into supplying software validation information. Things like, what are the requirements of the software? What is the architecture? How are you proving that this software actually works the way it is supposed to? So there's a lot of information there. You might have to have information about how the traceability for this particular software requirement applies all the way through the device life cycle and device use. Cybersecurity has become a very, very big, important issue. And we have actually an updated draft guidance that I believe came out in just like June of this 2025 that involves all of the cybersecurity requirements. They want to see a software bill of materials in a submission, and they want to see things in the labeling that inform the user about how to protect their precious data. So cybersecurity information, that's a key part of 510Ks these days for software devices. Some devices are going to require clinical performance data, even if they're very much software devices. I'll give you one example. I had a client with an app that was supply therapy through the phone for mothers with postpartum depression. So they could be at home, they didn't have to go to a therapist in person. And this required some clinical data because FDA wanted to see, does this really have any sort of efficacy? And they wanted compared to a sham. So clinical performance data, I have another client that has an implant that actually gets put into the bone. That's a class 3. That is going to be a long, long clinical trial to support their PMA that they're eventually going to support. So keep in mind, one of the key things after we get the classification and we figure out what type of submission it is figuring out what kinds of testing do you need to support that submission and show FDA the important data that they're looking for. A little bit more on de novo. We're talking about low to moderate risk, do not have a predicate device. The numbers of de novo submissions this year are probably about 1/10 the number of 510Ks. So it's not as common. Keep in mind that once a de novo gets cleared or gets granted so the product can go onto the market, there's a new classification set up, and now other companies can use your de novo cleared device as their predicate. So it creates a whole new space and it creates a new predicate, and that's how it works. It requires clinical data usually. It's more expensive in terms of user fees and amount of information that's supplied compared to a 510K. It's more of a 150-day timeline rather than 90 days typically for review of a 510K. And it's a lot of work. However, the big distinguishing point is that there is no pre-approval inspection of your quality management system. If you have a PMA device, FDA comes out, looks at the quality system on site before the device is approved. With a 510K and a de novo, you don't have that pre-approval inspection. Okay, so a little bit about PMA. We've got the big bucks here in the photo. Rule of thumb, usually these devices are for very high risk devices, things where the patient could in fact have some sort of serious injury or even death due to the device not working. These PMA applications are very expensive, take a lot of clinical data, can take years and years for FDA to review, and they do require pre-approval inspection. Typically, with a PMA these days, different modules are submitted individually. So there might be a whole module that's submitted on biocompatibility, and there might be a whole module that's submitted on animal testing. And then there might be a different module, here's our clinical data in humans. So it's often, let's get a big piece of information to the FDA and they can review that while we're trying to finish up other large pieces. Okay, let's give you some examples of what user fees are. So keep in mind that FDA's fiscal year is a little bit different than a typical calendar year. So it ends September 30th and October 1st is the fiscal year 2026. That's how it goes every year. So for a 510K, you're looking at $26,000 if you're a larger company. So let's say you have a company with $100 million in revenue a year. They're probably going to be considered a standard fee company, but many companies can file for a small business designation and pay a much smaller user fee. One thing to note is this annual establishment registration fee of $11,423 next year does not have any sort of small business discount. So this is the same fee whether you're a very, very small or very large company. And typically this amount goes up every year by a certain amount. So you can see how expensive some of these things are, like a PMA. Keep in mind though, that a first PMA from a small company does not have a user fee. So it's very important to figure in user fees when you're figuring out your budget and how you're going to approach your submission with FDA. Pre-submission meetings. We do a lot of pre-submission meetings. It's very important for certain companies to go talk to FDA, maybe present a protocol for an animal study or a human clinical study so that they have some idea of FDA's expectations. Some companies decide to not have a pre-submission, and they may have to repeat some very expensive, time-consuming testing if they submit and FDA does not like the approach. So lots of different questions can be asked. through the pre-submission process. They provide written feedback and as well as usually a teleconference to ask certain questions and have some better understanding about, well, what are you really looking for in the primary or secondary endpoints for this clinical trial? So it's very important for a larger investment type of submission to have a pre-submission. Also, keep in mind that pre-submissions are also used for devices that are trying to get breakthrough designation and want to have a special relationship with FDA, which involves quicker turnaround on their questions. Okay. So sometimes they're called pre-submissions, sometimes they're called Q-sub. They have a variety of different names, a variety of different purposes. Keep in mind that a pre-sub needs to be put together and presented with a lot of strategy. FDA is not just going to open up and tell you and act as a consultant on how you are supposed to proceed. They are expecting to be educated in the pre-sub, and then they expect to see specific questions like, FDA, do you agree with our primary endpoints in this clinical trial based upon our explanation of this device? So you ask specific questions like that. It's not a data review. It is not FDA giving advice, regulatory advice, but it is a way to present something to them and get their feedback and see if you're on the right track. Sometimes they even give very specific feedback, like we really want to see the two devices being used simultaneously during a clinical trial, things like that. So an open-ended question is probably not going to be answered, but it is a good way to have some sort of negotiation and early communication. And there is no user fee for a pre-submission, unlike going right to a 510K. All right. So clinical studies, we know that the EU MDR, I think a lot of countries around the world are looking to the EU's new medical device regulation and figuring out how to do their own regulation. The US is a bit different, but the US FDA likes to feel that they are getting the latest, highest level technology out to patients in the whole world. They don't want to be second to Japan or Europe or some other country. Okay, so keep in mind that clinical data, I'm seeing it requested for 510K devices much, much more than it was years ago. And of course, for de novo and PMA, they're going to have that. Okay, keep in mind that FDA is reluctant to take data from outside the US. So there are a few different reasons why they are reluctant to take this. There are specific US regulations for human subjects, et cetera, and how that's going to be approached. There may be differences in how certain populations respond to certain therapies. There are differences in the way that medicine is practiced and how a device might fit into a particular healthcare system. So FDA sees the US population as being more diverse than many other countries, and they often ask for multiple site clinical trials. So I know we're getting very
Amy.
at the end of time.
Sorry. Yeah,
That's okay.
just to say that it's coming. Yes, we have to
Yes.
wrap up. Thank you so much, Theo and Amy. This is so enlightening. There's so much information, and your presentation was very clear. I would like to know to wrap up, if each of you could say one tip that you would give to anybody that wants to start entering the market or start the application for FDA.
One tip, it's a very, very complex landscape. Don't be afraid to reach out to an expert and make sure that you're not wasting time and money.
Yeah. My tip is going to be similar. Reach out early to make sure, and somewhat self-serving, I understand that, but it's entirely true. You want to make sure that you're focusing on what needs to be focused on rather than, dedicating a lot of time and energy towards something you find out when it comes to getting approval or clearance in the USA that it wasn't necessary, it was a waste of time. So it's helpful to have regulatory guidance early when you're developing a medical device. So please contact us as soon as possible when you think you're developing a product, and we'll help you figure out what you need for the US.
Well, don't worry about
Thank you.
that, Amy and Theo. You both are first in line for us and for our community, and that's why you're here. And I know I've already gotten a couple notes from people on the call that it was perfect. They're like, oh my God.
Good.
Super.
So super glad to have you all today. And you know, I think if we have questions, then we can send people along your way to
Appreciate it.
to have a
Yes.
consult.
Thank you so
Great.
much for having us. We really appreciate being part of your program.
Yeah.
Thank
you
you
very
for
much.
being here.
Absolutely, everybody. It's great to have you, and we'll see you soon. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.